Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the key takeaways from the proxy season. We hope that by the end of the webinar, you are very well positioned for next year's proxy. My name is Jerry Isbell, and I'd like to welcome our speakers today from Perlmutter. We have Sharon Podstupka and Kim Neal. And before we get started today, I'd like to turn it over to Mary for some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Jerry, and welcome everyone. Perlmutter team is here again to put an informative presentation, helping our compensation committee members really prepare for fall meetings based on the results from the proxy season. So I know this topic is going to drive a lot of questions among all of the audience. And so I recommend and I ask you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. Just look at that on the right of the screen. And we're going to save some time at the end for that Q&A. But go ahead and populate it as soon as you start getting those questions in. Submitting a question with your name, we want you to know that we'll try to get all the questions at the end of this webinar. But in case we don't, we will be sharing your contact information with the Perlmutter team so that they can respond. And then that will also give them the opportunity to share additional great thought leadership with you in the future. The number one question that we always get is this webinar going to be available and are the slides available? Yes, take a look in the resources corner and you'll be able to get these slides in PDF format. They'll also be available to you in a link that comes after this webinar in an email. All right, as always, we'll be recording this webinar and the webinar will be available next week, both on NACD and Perlmutter websites. And the next slide, I know the second question I always get is about credits. Yes, this is available for 1 credit for my certified directors and my fellows. It takes about 30 days post-event to show up in your folio. So if you are interested, please, in the certification program that NACD provides, this is a really great way to differentiate yourselves from other board directors. And really, if there's something, if there is a way that you are wanting to step outside of the crowd, this is one great way to do it. My recommendation is to get in touch with your board advisor or your member engagement advisor. Also, you can drop a little note in the chat. I know that my members from my team are there if you are interested in learning more, or you can go onto our website. All right. Finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about evaluation questions that we'll provide at the end. We'll do that, so stick around afterwards and let us know how we're doing it. Provide that insight and also give us an opportunity to improve these sessions for you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our experts because that's the real reason you're here. Sharon, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you so much, Mary. We really appreciate the introductions. Kim and I are thrilled to have you all here and especially delighted to have Jerry joining us today for this discussion. We know that 2025 has certainly given us a lot to talk about, only halfway through the year. So we're going to spend our time today talking about the economic uncertainty in today's environment, the heightened investor expectations and proxy advisor expectations, as well as the regulatory environment, which seems to be changing every single day, and how these things are shaping not just decisions, but disclosures around executive pay, and use some of the data that we've learned from last year's proxy filings to help us prepare for the fall. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kim, to get us grounded in some data, since we do have a lot to cover.
Perfect. So on the next slide, we can go ahead and start to ground our level here, make sure that we all understand what happened last year with our proxy disclosures just really earlier this year. So what we're doing here is focusing on that S&P 500 group to be an example for what we expect in the broader market. So really here, the big point is with CEO pay, we're seeing single-digit increases at median year over year. So the most recent year at a 7% increase, that's been consistent with what we've seen. Now, this is median. We might see a little bit more movement at the 25th and 75th percentile, so around the edges, but generally pretty steady increases. Also, looking at pay mix. So we're seeing stability here over the last 3 years as well. you'll see the majority of pay mix is incentive based, right? So over 90% of the pay mix is incentive driven, and over 75% is long-term incentives. We did see some minor shifting in those long-term incentives. So you'll see percentage point movement. So very minor movement, performance-based LTI increased slightly while options decreased. I really suspect it's a few minor companies that have changed their mix that is impacting this. But overall, the story is kind of a steady state. Jerry, in your experience, is this surprising? Is this what you were expecting?
Yes, this lines up perfectly with what I'm seeing, especially where you have companies that have CEOs that have been in place for a while. This is pretty well just right in line. And again, the broadest mix is over to LTI, which many companies are pushing through their increases through more on the LTI than on anything else. So this is right in line with what I'm seeing.
Jerry, that's a great point. So we do typically see those increases in LTI shareholder aligned, and the opportunity being longer term, over 3+ years. So that's a great value add there. Now, I think we can all agree with this slide, really no big surprises. So we can move to the next one. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at the short-term incentive mix. And you'll see the story is pretty consistent here as well. So no real big surprises. We continue to see companies using a multi-metric approach to their STI programs. So diversifying across different metrics, across different buckets to kind of de-risk the programs. In terms of metric prevalence, what you'll see at the top here, these are the metrics that are rising to the top. And this is pretty consistent with what we've seen in prior years. So we're seeing ESG and individual performance come to the top. These are those non-financial measures that, I would say back in COVID, these were starting to be introduced into our programs, and we've kind of maintained them. They've been working. It's been a way to de-risk from just a pure financial-based program and to give executives an opportunity to focus on different areas, whether it be through individual performance. We can see strategic objectives not too far off. So aligning your full executive team on certain key milestones. We continue to see this approach in our plans. And of course, you'll see revenue and profitability metrics in the mix as well. So overall, we're really seeing some consistency, which is great. We like to see incentive programs that can be in play for more than 1 year. We want some continuity year over year. And I think this market data is really emphasizing that. There's some adjustments around the fringes, but the overall plan itself is predominantly maintaining year over year. And Jerry, I know the CEO pay mix wasn't too much of a surprise, but what's your take on the short-term incentive programs? Have you seen any major changes? What are your thoughts?
This lines up very well with what I've been seeing. And I think that, everybody has the base financial metrics that are pretty consistent year on year. And then you've got a section that'll be around some sort of personal performance. And oftentimes this is where the CEO can drive, subsections of, the strategy into the different executives. And then that cascades down within the organization. So it's a nice overall framework that is being utilized by, pretty much every company that I've been in contact with. So this lines up great.
That's a great point. And what's interesting about, the strategic objectives or those individual performance components, that can be a portion of your program. It might only be 20, 25%. It might be a small weighting, but it's still there. And as that bucket, you can retain it year over year. And Jerry, as you alluded to, you can adjust what those objectives are year over year. So you can tailor the program, but the overall structure remains the same. So that's nice to have with the consistency there in design.
So I'm sorry to jump in here, Kim and Jerry, but to me, the big question here and what's not specific on the slide is how DE&I fits into the overall ESG bucket. And we know that that's been such a hot topic in the boardroom, in the media. And, here we're specifically talking about how DE&I metrics may or may not fit into incentive plans. So I'm wondering if it might be okay to take a moment now to poll the audience.
Perfect.
Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, here we are on the polling question. I'd love to invite our listeners to take a moment and answer this question. So, and I have a pop-up on my computer. So how has your organization taken any of the following actions as it relates to DE&I metrics within executive STI plans? And you can see there are 4 responses here. Remove DEI metrics completely, made some changes to DEI metrics, no changes to DEI metrics, or never use DEI metrics, or no plans to include. So take a moment, answer the question. Kim and Jerry, I'd love to get your insights on some of these responses as they come in.
Well, DEI is a very hot topic these days, and what in the boardrooms that I've been in, what we've been discussing is, what we've had for our metrics, around ESG and DEI in particular, they have been really driven out of the strategy. And so what you have to think about here is internal versus external. And on an internal level, you're likely doing all the same things internally that you've always done and always been focused on. But frankly, in today's environment, you maybe want to think about how you talk about it externally. And we can see, here from the polling, how changes are being thought about by 30 some odd % of the respondents here. So it's today's environment really does cause you to think about this. And Kim, I'm sure you're seeing the same things.
Yeah, and I'm not too surprised. We're seeing the results come through now, and overwhelmingly, we're seeing the never used DEI metrics come into play. But of those that have incorporated it, there is a nice mix between those who have removed, those that did some changes, and those that did no changes. So I think this would be a great transition to our next slide, so we can at least look at what did all the companies in the S&P 500 do, and then we can bring it back to what are we hearing really right now in today's boardrooms. So here is just another pulse on what we saw with the most recent disclosures for proxies. You can see off to the left-hand side, any type of ESG continues to be relevant. So these are strong prevalence figures across all 3 years, right? So pretty much steady, straight in line. What we have on the right-hand side of the chart are just some different sub-buckets, if you will, where all these categories can come into play. And as you eyeball across these 3 years for these various buckets, you can see pretty consistent. The most drastic change has happened in that DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion bucket, where we see a stark decline in 2024. Now, I know this may not be much of a surprise, and Jerry, we kind of just talked through it, and we saw the results of the polling where really it is all over the board. I think it depends upon what stage you are in with these metrics. But I'm not too surprised with this decline, given the recent environment, given the new administration. And I think we might continue to see this decline. But one thing that's important to call out, this is 24 data. So what we're experiencing right now hasn't hit the data yet. And just because we're seeing declines in prevalence doesn't mean conversations aren't still being had, right? So I want to remind us that this slide is really speaking to ESG metric prevalence in our short-term incentive programs. So just because we're, like the polling suggested, we might be making some changes, no changes, all changes, doesn't mean that we're not still monitoring DE&I as part of, the compensation committee or the broader board responsibilities. Doesn't mean that it's gone away, just perhaps not front and foremost in the STI programs. Jerry, when you see this data, this kind of illustrates what you were mentioning earlier, but does this at all surprise you? Do you feel like this aligns with what you were expecting?
It does align. And, when under the environment ones, I see a lot of safety and quality that stay high in the STI metrics. So, we'll keep an eye on all the DEI and how people talk about it and how it's measured. And, I've seen a lot around wording changing to talk more about belonging and inclusion, or talent development, broader terminology being used, but still being focused on your employees and your growth and inclusion amongst your staff, so that you get, the best possible outcomes on behalf of your customers.
I think that's a great point, Jerry. I've heard in the boardroom, some more intentional conversations about how are we looking at this? If it is being included, how are we including it? Does it reflect our culture? If DE&I is part of your company, then maintaining it might be the best path forward. So this certainly doesn't mean everyone is running, away from DE&I. We're just seeing a little bit of a decline. Perhaps companies just being a little bit more intentional about how and where they're using it, and taking a little bit of a pause in this most recent year with the proxy filings we've seen.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I think we can, in the vein of having, we looked at STI program design, how that's maintained somewhat consistency year over year. We've taken a brief look at ESG. We're not too surprised by DE&I decline. Aside from that, ESG in and of itself has maintained consistency year over year. Let's shift to the next topic. And I think we're going to actually sit on this next slide, for a little bit, because this really resonates with 2025. As Sharon alluded to at the beginning, a lot has already happened. Where, halfway through the year, a little over halfway through the year, we still have plenty of time for things to change, right, in 25. So this here, what we're really speaking to is STI program resilience. Everything I've mentioned so far gives the illusion of consistency year over year, but part of that is being intentional about your program designs, what sort of levers you have in place. Now, this slide is really just kind of a reminder. I know, at least in my experience, we've kind of built this toolbox of different approaches to your STI program during COVID. How can we make our programs resilient, a little less volatile due to market conditions? So we built this toolkit with different approaches to kind of layer in our STI programs. And what's interesting is some companies have continued to maintain them. They haven't pulled away. Some companies are just seeing these for the first time. COVID may not have impacted their industry, their business in the same way. So this might be the first time you're hearing about some of these approaches, but the idea behind it is to make your program more resilient. So what we had mentioned before, the multi-metric approach to your incentive program, kind of de-risking, spreading it across different metrics, introducing those non-financial metrics. So it's not 100% financial based, but you can pull in individual or any sort of strategic items for those key milestones to still recognize your executive team and the efforts they put forth. Now, something new that we're seeing that is new for this slide that we're going to introduce is the idea of adjusting those performance and payout ranges. So this is another lever you have. Year over year, it doesn't have to be consistent. We usually anchor target at budget, but where you set that threshold payout, so the minimum entry point, and that maximum payout, those can adjust. And we're seeing companies widen those ranges. So that way executives have a better chance of landing on that scorecard. Now, part of this design, not only are we looking at those ranges, but where the goals are set. So if we're lowering the threshold, it might be a little bit easier to hit threshold, fall in between threshold and target. But similarly, you may have lowered that payout range, that payout level for your minimum. On the other end, maximum is much more difficult to obtain. So where it's the pros and cons, the gives and takes of widening that range. What you'll also see, and I think this is stuck and become quite popular, is the idea of a strike zone around target. So essentially, what I mentioned before, we anchor target around budget. Establishing the budget can be challenging, right? In times like this, where the market's volatile, we don't really know this full year out what to truly expect. This takes some of the pressure off of that budgeting process and the target setting process. So essentially, around target, you might say 98% to 102% of target performance, that is a target payout. So we've almost created this little strike zone around target, so there isn't so much pressure on it. And I will say part of widening that target to an actual range around it, you just need to be mindful of any unintended consequences. We don't want the slope down to threshold or the slope up to maximum to become steeper. So of course, we work with one lever, we need to check the other levers as we go to make sure the program makes sense. But these are just a few different ways to consider making your programs just a little bit more resilient on the front end. Now, of course, once the year plays out, and this might be where most of us are for 25, right? We're still in the throes of it. The year has not ended. We don't know what to expect. We may just have to be prepared to use discretion if it makes sense. And we say judicious use of discretion. So very intentional. We want to make sure that if discretion is applied in a positive manner, perhaps on the other way, it would be applied on a negative manner. We want to make sure that it swings, the pendulum swings both ways, and the use of discretion makes sense and is justified. Now, these are just a few techniques that we kind of brought to the forefront for the discussion, but I think, Jerry, I'm sure everyone's interested to hear what you have to say. Are there any items here that you've used, you've discussed? Are there any other kind of levers you could consider that we didn't cover?
Well, Kim, I think you've covered a lot, and I can tell you that we've used everything that you have talked about here. So, once COVID hit, we all got thrown into a world that we had not been in before. And so the widening out, we learn, is an important thing to, because you just can't know everything that's going to happen in the future. And so giving some grace and some widening out, especially if you came off of a very low payout or a no payout year, you want to be cognizant of keeping your whole company's head in the game as you go into the next year. The other thing that I think is important to do, especially if you have an adjusted EBITDA or an adjusted net income that you use as one of your financial metrics, go through your list of adjustments. What are going to be your exclusions in the calculation? And, this year tariffs could be something that if you don't have it in this year's exclusion items, you might consider it in next year's exclusion items. And it could be something that if you do use positive discretion that you utilize tariff, let's just say tariff adjustment, that's something you want to outline very carefully in your proxy. And so if collectively you, the compensation committee, you, the board, want to make positive discretion, just make sure that it is grounded in very thoughtful discussion and items that you can disclose to your shareholders that will be understandable to the best of your ability. But you really do need to go through a really well-documented disclosure when you do have a positive discretion. But I would encourage everybody to think about their list of exclusions, because you can't have 800 items on the list, but you want to be thoughtful about what you do include on that list. But everything you've discussed here, I have seen utilized.
Jerry, that's great. I like the list of exclusions or adjustments. It's almost like a playbook of if this happens, then we can do this. So it helps keep everyone centered and grounded at the beginning on the same page. So when those discussions happen after the fact, everyone is up to speed on the same page with what sort of adjustments might or could be made. Now, you did mention a lot about disclosures, and I can't help but just tag Sharon in, because I know she's champing at the bit here, to talk a little bit more about what we should be considering.
Thanks, Kim. So before we go to the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit just in general about communication around STI plans. I think, what we've all heard here today, it's not surprising. These plans are complex, and directors spend lots of time and care designing these programs to make sure they align with strategy, that they're driving the right behaviors, and ultimately driving performance to, meet those targets or exceed those targets. So, what we've done at Perlmeyer, we did a survey. We can go to the next slide in June of 2025, just to keep in mind, it's important for directors, just as an insight, to think about how confident you are as a director that participants, not just in the C-suite, but the participants in your incentive, your STI plan, understand what actually drives those payouts. And we had about 300 respondents in our survey. We'll get to those results soon. But it's interesting to see this feedback on whether it's very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or not at all confident. So if you could just take a few moments here to read the question and think about the survey. I know, Kim, we talk a lot to our clients about making sure that, not just the metrics are understood behind these plans, but the goals and what executives and other participants can do to affect those goals.
Now, Sharon, I know all the results, I see some movement happening,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm seeing a clear trend where the somewhat confident seems to be pulling ahead in this poll. Does that surprise you at all?
Not at all. And if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that actually these results track with what we heard from HR management. And I'm not here to set off any alarm bells. I think the key here is just to remember that with moderate confidence around what drives the payouts, there is room for improvement and there are gaps. And so what are those gaps? And I know we talk a lot on these calls in particular with directors as our audience about external disclosure and the importance of telling your story in your CD&A. But it's also important to tell that story internally. So if we go quickly to the next slide, what we found in this survey is that what companies are really good at internally is the what. Telling participants what the metrics are and what the goals are. And from time to time, generally quarterly aligned with quarterly earnings calls, we'll give some updates to participants. Mostly actually the senior participants, it falls off a little bit below the C-suite. But the why and the how, the clear explanation of why the committee chose these metrics, why they're important to the business, how the goals were set, and why they're so rigorous, but stretched, achievable, and how people in their roles, executives and those in these plans, what they can do every single day to influence results. So this is a little astray from talking about proxy disclosure, but there are parallels. And I think that companies, and Jerry, we talked about this in the prep call, really do take the time and care to make sure that that story is as airtight as possible. And, translating that internally can be a little bit more difficult. Would you agree?
It is. It's very difficult. As you said, at the executive level and at the higher levels in the company, you can have these discussions and explanations, but much more broadly inside the company, it's a challenge for the executive team to bring everybody along and have everyone understand what they can be doing to influence the positive outcome. So it's a tough communication that each executive is trying to do. So, I commend you for working with your clients on this.
Thanks. Well, it's really, we do think it's really important, and it does dovetail into the external, right? Because it's not just ISS and Glass Lewis who are reading your proxy statement. It is your population. It is your incentive plan participants, and they will look to see how the top 5 got paid and whether or not the incentive payouts differ, or the bonus plan funding is different at the top than maybe below the C-suite. So I think that probably gives us a good segue into our favorite topic, say on pay.
Yes. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to transition into say on pay and look at some data. But before we do want to get a sense of where everyone in this webinar is kind of sitting at this point. So our third polling question here is, have you experienced a low say on pay vote? So low being less than 80%. Note that this is not a fail. It's just a lower say on pay support. So go ahead, and we've got a yes or no. This should be relatively quick. And I'm seeing the results come in, and I'm not too surprised. We're seeing the no's take away with the highest result with a few yeses. And I think that's to be expected.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, I think this is definitely a good thing to see. The majority really heavily weighted towards no, have not had a less than 80% say on pay vote. Now, we know that's not a fail, right? If 15% is a fail, but in the eyes of our friends at ISS and Glass Lewis, below 80% is less than good. So I guess, Jerry, we wanted to make sure that we asked you the question, have you ever been in the penalty box?
Thank goodness, no, never in the penalty box. And one of the things that's very important here is your shareholder outreach. So I don't know if you're going to cover that on the next slide, but if you've got an above 80 or the 92 or 90+%, your shareholder outreach is very, very important to make sure that you understand what your top investors are looking for from inside your company, what questions they have. So whether you got a low or a high, shareholder outreach is a really important thing to do.
That's very true, Jerry. And I think we can actually, like you mentioned, let's go on that next slide and let's just take a look at what the data is suggesting. So again, S&P 500 companies, we can see how the results played out over the past few years. In this chart, I'll just call out that blue line. I know there's a lot going on here. So the blue line is just the average say on pay support. And that really has hovered around 90%. So that is strong support. What we're doing is layering in almost the influence of ISS on these say on pay results. So the green line above, just a slight uptick. You can see when ISS recommends a 4, your say on pay. But to the negative, that red line, if ISS recommends against, you can see there's a significant decline in our say on pay results. So this really, it isn't anything new. We know ISS can influence the results, and an against recommendation can really lead to negative, investor sentiment. So, Terry, luckily enough, was not in the camp of experiencing a low say on pay. So she's definitely doing something right. Now, Sharon, for those of us that maybe aren't as lucky as Jerry, that may have had one or two, maybe multiple, what should we be thinking about? But I think more importantly, what should we be doing?
So those are two really great questions. And I think I want to just touch on what Jerry started with, which is the shareholder engagement and outreach. Mm-hmm. It's important, sort of regardless of whether you're in the doghouse or not. Having those relationships will help you in the long run when, in fact, at some point, you might have an issue. We've had situations where there have been surprises, things like a retention bonus or an unconventional severance payment, or even just some governance things have happened, or the pay for performance hasn't been told in such a good way. Maybe you set targets lower than last year and didn't explain it. We've seen that be an irritant. So what directors should be doing now is just reminding their management teams, regardless of where you are, that we need to start thinking about the story now for next year. So if you were in the doghouse for 2025, you've got work to do, right? You've got to do your shareholder outreach. You need to listen and respond, demonstrate that responsiveness in your CD&A narrative. What we heard and the what we did has become sort of table stakes in these situations. and really sharpen that pencil around the narrative to make sure that it is transparent, it is robust, and it is clear. And what's happening, and we're going to go to the next slide, we know that security has been a real issue, complexities around security, not just in the disclosures, which we'll also talk about, but unfortunately has become a very hot topic in the boardroom, again, outside of the boardroom. And we'd like to spend some time talking about it here today. It's with, you can see the question on the slide here, the poll, are you talking about security perquisites in your boardroom? And so the responses are coming in. Not surprised, right here?
Mm-hmm. I'm not surprised by a lot of yeses. I feel like if it's not happening yet, it may be happening here in the near future. Jerry, what are your thoughts on this topic and your experience?
I think this is a topic that is getting more and more on people's minds. I mean, even today, another unfortunate occurrence. So it's definitely on people's minds. And I believe if it hasn't been talked in your boardroom, it's going to be talked in your boardroom, because this is really, it's a very scary situation. And, you know, we ask a lot of our executives, and then to worry about your personal safety, your family's personal safety. I think it's a topic that the boardroom must have a discussion over.
That's exactly how we were seeing this play out. And I think what we can do, we've got some data on the next slide, but again, I'm going to preface this with the data that you will see. Again, this is 24 fiscal year, right? So this was what was just disclosed. Like Jerry mentioned, there's been a lot of movement currently, a lot happening, and so the conversations may be had currently. But we did see an uptick in prevalence of security within S&P 500. So looking at personal, home, cybersecurity, we're seeing, about a third of S&P 500 providing it. And what's interesting is we wanted to take a closer look at the values. What sort of value was being placed on these different security benefits? Now, the value of perquisites can sometimes raise those red flags. So we did a deep dive to see of those CEOs that are getting some large perquisite figures. So over $100,000, where are they going? And you'll see here what's interesting. I don't think this is too much of a surprise. Aircraft happens to be the highest, but we're still seeing, 27, about 30% with traditional security. So a high prevalence in what we could call security, right? Aircraft for secure travel, traditional security in the sense of home, cyber, personal. So strong prevalence here. Now, again, this data is from most recent proxies. Given the environment we landed at the end of 24, what we're in right now, what we were in yesterday, the conversations like Jerry and Sharon mentioned are being had now or will be had soon. So we expect that prevalence to continue to increase. Now, what is interesting is security in the SEC eyes is just like any other perquisite, right? There is a personal benefit that's not available to the employee-wide basis. So this is similar, and disclosures are expected just like club memberships, financial planning. So all of those traditional perquisites, security is falling into a similar bucket where the dollar value and explanation must be provided. What's interesting is this kind of complicates some things around security. How much do we disclose? We don't want to give too much information in our proxy, but we want to give enough so our shareholders understand the need and the keenness, the actual rationale for whatever security might be provided. So we'll be getting to this, just not quite yet. But the good news is the SEC has this under review. The complications around perquisites are there, and they're recognizing them. And Jerry, I know you mentioned the conversations being had. Has the complication around disclosure bubbled up just yet, or has it really just been around assessing what are the needs? Is there a need? What can we do? We'll deal with disclosure later.
primarily the discussion is around need and what we can do from a protection standpoint. And I'm a firm believer on if you are doing the right thing on behalf of the company and the executive, how you call that out in your proxy and how you disclose that is going to be perfectly understood. And in some ways, it's going to get to be a little bit of a, why aren't you protecting your executive, right? I mean, it's just, it's a scary time that we're in right now. So we take the disclosure and just know that we're going to have to do it.
It's really interesting. It's sort of this philosophical question. It's so real and so live, right? Just given the last 24 hours has my head spinning. Is it a perk or is it protection?
Right.
And so how do we define those things? Again, we have the challenge of the proxy advisors looking at this in a certain way. And the numbers, as you can see here on the slide, can be significant, right? So is it the unintended consequence of inflating that total comp number and the summary comp table being overlooked? And so it really has started to get pretty complicated. And as Kim said, I think the good news here, right, is that it is on the SEC's radar. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there are any comments here, but we can probably move on to the next slide because it really just segues right into the complexities around disclosure. And so this is really the latest and greatest. Many of you on the call have probably heard about the SEC roundtable. It was held back in June, so a little bit over a month ago. SEC leadership, investor leadership, governance folks, even just public filers were invited to come and discuss these issues around executive compensation disclosure, with the key question being, is the disclosure giving investors the right information to make good decisions? So if that's really the guiding principle, where can we make improvements or pull back? So we know the rules are complicated. We know that there are proxies out there, even CDNAs. We're just talking about the CDNA that can be upwards of 80 pages, right, Jerry? Right. And how material is the narrative and the tables together? What are we giving to our stakeholders? One of the favorite topics, I think, among us executive compensation professionals has been around the PVP disclosure and what that's the gift that's given us all with respect to just the workload, the complexity of the calculations, getting it done in time to file. In addition, there was conversation about clawbacks and the practicality of that disclosure and what is it really giving to investors in terms of decision making. And lastly, which is not on this slide, but we also had a lively discussion about it, is my personal favorite, the CEO pay ratio, and which, way back when those rules were finalized, thought that we were going to see the face of executive compensation change forever. And it really just turned into a giant snoozer, right? So what is it doing today? And then lastly, what we just talked about, the real life unintended consequences, complications around executive security disclosures and this push and pull between perk and protection, and how those numbers or those disclosures may increase risk. I mean, real risk. If you know where an executive's airport is and it's disclosed in the proxy, is that something we should be actually transparent about?
This is all very interesting. I think it's about finding that fine balance between giving shareholders all the information they require, but not overwhelming with this document and creating a long-winded CDNA, focusing on the areas that really matter. And some of these disclosures, I think it's great. It's a great health check of, does all of this still make sense? The world is changing. Things are different. So it's great to always take a moment to pause and think through everything that we're providing in these disclosures based on requirements. Are they value adds, or has it just become a mundane exercise? A lot of work, like Sharon said, in that CEO pay ratio, even more in those pay versus performance disclosures. It's a lot to require for these public companies. So taking a step back and seeing, did these disclosures actually provide value as intended? Do we make some small adjustments? Do we do away with them altogether? I think it's kind of up in the air.
I guess, and so here's the $1 million question to
Yeah.
you, Julie. It's my favorite question. So if you had a crystal ball, right, and or actually a wish that you could make, what's the top thing you'd like to see here happen?
Remove the pay for performance table. That's my number one. It is so time consuming on behalf of the finance department, on behalf of HR, legal, for everything that has to go in the proxy on this. And I just don't understand what additional value this provides to an investor. So that's my number one request: get rid of pay the PVP table.
It's really interesting too. I'm gonna just harp on this for one more moment, because I do think it's important as we think about disclosures going forward. Nothing's going to change for this proxy season, and we'll get to that in a minute. But there was a purpose and a methodology behind guiding companies to put the PVP disclosures and the CEO pay ratio outside of the CD&A narrative, right? Because that's not really part of the story. It's an SEC compliance exercise. And I think we still stand by that very strongly, that your CD&A narrative is the place to tell your story. And to be very clear, on the intro of those particular disclosures, that please go read our CD&A. This is where we talk about the connections between pay and performance, our decision-making process, the governance, et cetera. So I think it's a really good thing that these are on the SEC's radar. And if we go to our next slide, again, no crystal ball here, unfortunately, but we can kind of hope for what we see the path forward to be. I almost wish we had a polling question for everybody with choices about what they'd like to see stay or go.
The wish list.
Yeah, maybe for the next call. But I think what we hope to see out of this are, again, an emphasis on plain English, clear, transparent disclosure that makes sense for investors. If not, the termination of the PVP tables, maybe fix some of it, streamline it, review how those cap calculations might work, or be more principle based in the way that things are reported. What we talked about, I think maybe ad nauseum here, is the perk clarifications, especially around executive security. Perk or protection? What are we going to disclose? How are we going to disclose it and make sure we're giving the right amount of information, good information to our investors, but also protecting our people? And I think that's really the biggest issue. And then lastly, some of these other Dodd-Frank, stragglers, I'll call them, the CEO pay ratio and the clawbacks, how might those rules change to make life easier for us all, especially us CD&A drafters. In terms of the public input and timeline, you can see here on the slide, the comment file is actually still open. I went out there late last week. You can go to the SEC website and actually see some of the public commentary and what some of my colleagues and our other experts in the exec comp field, as well as lawyers and even public filers, have submitted in terms of their public feedback and requests. And then hopefully by the end of this year, we'll learn about some proposals. And for those who are calendar filers, this probably will not change the way you're disclosing for 2025 and your 2026 proxy. And we can probably expect to see some change later next year and into 2027. How does this timeline feel to you guys?
Sounds about right. Sharon, we've got some great questions coming in. If I think you've got one more slide, and then I can move into some questions.
Sure, that would be great.
That sounds great. Yeah. So we've got one last slide here. This is really just the final takeaway. I'm not going to go through it in detail right now, but you all will have access to those slides. This is your takeaway. This is your checklist to bring back to the boardroom. It ties into each category we covered, just something to continue or even start the conversations on the different areas. So this is a nice tool for you in our slide deck. But with that, I think, Jerry, if you want to kick off some of these questions, we can see what's interesting for the audience.
Okay. The first one is, are you seeing any increase in the vesting time on RSUs? This is something that has been talked about in relation to the performance stock units that we see in LTI. So Kim, you might want to address what you're seeing or what your companies are starting to talk about now.
Jerry, you hit the nail on the head. So this was brought up by ISS having in their questionnaire, just getting the feelers out there about how corporate America felt about, potentially replacing PSUs or your performance-based aspect of your LTI program with longer-winded time-based vesting. So that means your RSUs or your stock options, instead of that typical 3-year, might have a 4 or 5+ year period to vest over. The thought being is we all aim to have those PSUs pay out at a certain pace over a certain number of years. But the PSUs present so many challenges. We just went through annual incentive plan goal setting for 1 year. 3 years is even more challenging. So this is the way to kind of get around, but still end up kind of in the same place. So this is where I think it's stemming from, just like you mentioned, Jerry, is that ISS question. The answer to that, from what we're seeing right now, in the data for 24, still sticking with that 3-year vesting. That seems to be strong. That is our long-term vesting period. And what I'm hearing in the boardroom is a lot of interest around what would it look like if we had longer vesting and didn't have to work through the PSU complications each year. There's a lot of interest, but not much action. I think everyone's waiting to see where it goes. Jerry, is that what you're hearing? Is that what your experience is?
It is exactly. The other thing I heard, not only longer vesting, say 4, 5, 6 years, but potentially even cliff vesting, so that, again, if you want a long-term perspective, you've got to stay a long time to receive. And so, from an executive standpoint, I'm not sure I'd want to give up, 3 years of performance vesting versus a 6-year cliff vesting. I don't know. It's a real trade-off that you have to think about when you do your design work on this.
That'll be really. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Kim. I love these conversations. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens coming out of the 2025 proxy season.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Sharon, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And this is it goes along with the proxy and the matrices inside proxies. So as we're looking at the director matrix, and sometimes before there was gender and racial diversity put into the director matrix, skill-based matrix. What are you seeing on a go-forward basis as it relates to the current directors and then board recruitment for new directors? Are you seeing any changes based on what's going on in the rest of the environment?
That's a really, really good question. I actually wish I had some data to answer the question. So I can't really say what we've seen in terms of changes in the proxy statements. I know that there's a lot of sensitivity around it, but it's a little bit early for me to say, to be totally honest. And in terms of Kim in the boardroom, the discussions that you're having around board recruitment, how does that tie in?
I think we can pivot this question just a little bit to use the information we have, which is what are the conversations we're having now?
Right.
And I think the directors are looking for a diverse skill set, bringing in the AI, bringing in the cyber. There's definitely a want and desire for the tech knowledge, but also understanding we don't want a director that is just our AI person. They have to bring more than just that, right? We want them to be able to contribute across the conversations, across the committees, and perhaps they do have a specialty in one of these new emerging areas. But I think having a balanced approach and the ability to really add value to the board still is the top driver for director selection.
Yeah, I agree. Director selection is it's incredibly important. And so you cannot just be a one-sided individual that's brought into the boardroom. So it's very important to have a broad range of skills. So I don't know if we can squeeze one more in, but we'll try more. The one of the questions was, in particular, if you're using positive discretion in your short-term incentives, do you have any tools or tips of the trade to stay out of the ISS and Glass Lewis crosshairs on this?
I think the answer, at least for me, in terms of a storyteller for your disclosures, is just to be really clear about what the objectives were. And I like to always tie it back to business results, right? So those best-in-class CDNAs include an executive summary that talk about the key highlights, whether it be financial or non-financial, and tying back those discretionary decisions to the successes and achievements during the year, and also tying it back to what you're publicly disclosing broader in your annual report, in your quarterly, earnings releases is really important. That will help.
I think Sharon hit the nail on the head with that. The only item I would add is just keeping in mind magnitude. How
Right.
much discretion are you applying? Always being responsible with that, and it will tie into your disclosure, as Sharon mentioned.
All right. Thank you, ladies, so much for all this great information, for your expertise, Jerry, for your experience that you always provide for our members. And while we ran out of time and we were only able to get to a couple questions, we did see a lot of those come through. And so please be on the lookout for one of our friends from Pearl Meyer to respond to your question via email post the webinar. So we'll send those over to them. They'll get those in the next week or so. I have a few quick little reminders before we all jump off, but first is to just remind everyone to please fill out that evaluation. It's in the attendee hub, and it just really does help us improve our webinars. It helps our speakers improve. It helps us understand the topics that you want to see. And really, it helps us with this webinar series, because I want to remind everyone to keep an eye out on that next compensation webinar series that's coming in December. So be on the lookout in December. You can register on our webinars page. Also, any archives of this webinar or any of the past webinars that we've done this year can be found on NACD's webinar archive page and on Pearl Meyer's page as well. With that, I want to invite everybody also not to forget to join us for some of our in-person events. It's September 17th. We'll be in Boston for our Leading Minds of Governance. And so if you're in the Boston area or up in the Northeast, we hope that you can join us. In October, we'll be in the DC area for the largest gathering of directors in the US. And that's at our NACD Directors Summit. And we just hope that you'll take advantage of all the great networking, speakers, and education opportunity. Pearl Meyer will be there. Jerry, I'm sure, will be there. And so we hope that we will see you there. With that, I want to just thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank our partner, Pearl Meyer, and I hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.